This just in. Breaking news. Healers revolting? Oh my god, we have to cut to Wowhead's newest healer correspondent, Theun, for this week's breaking news as to what the healers are upset about now.
Hello, how's it going? It's me.
What's up? Okay, so we're going to be talking about healing Mythic Plus this week. I think there's actually been a decent amount of discourse. I think it spawned mostly off of this tweet from Elsmere, but I think this has been a conversation that's been happening for a while. Every single time like bosses get nerfed, there's a little bit of a conversation about how hard healing checks are in dungeons this season, and honestly this expansion relative to how they have been in the past. And the tweet that started this off is from Elsmere. It says, "I'm tired of healing power being so low in Mythic Plus this expansion. Heal checks are at an all-time high, and healer power is at an all-time low because they keep nerfing healers. I understand these mob health / damage adjustments helped in Raid, but it feels terrible in Mythic Plus as a solo healer." And they're referring to the increased HP that they have given us twice now this expansion, yeah?
Yeah. I think that's like kind of where the issue stemmed from in the beginning anyway, is like
Yeah.
we got buffed by, it was like 40%, I think was the first buff in like really late beta. They buffed our HP by like 40%. And then this patch, was it 20 or
was it 25? I was thinking it was 25,
Yeah.
but it might be 20.
So, but yeah, so they've done that, and like it kind of needed to happen because healers have gained like a bunch of throughput on their talent trees that was kind of unaccounted for in like tuning throughout the beta. So this is like kind of a band-aid fix for that issue. I think like kind of the bigger issue that they didn't really account for is like they never went back and like fixed spot healing tools. So like Holy Shock is like really weak right now. And then I, followed up to Elsmere's tweet with like, I was looking at like how much a Riptide heals for. We have like 600,000 HP with Power Word Fortitude or whatever. And my Riptide heals someone for 24k. So
very good.
Like, yeah. And like whenever a bleed on like Sentinel Telandros is hitting you for like, I think it's like over 300k per tick or something on like really high keys. Like what's a 24k hot gonna do? Like It's not gonna do anything. So that's, I think, what the issue is, less so like the healer checks are difficult. I think it's like the tools that we have maybe aren't sufficient at the moment.
Well, part of this stems from bosses being really hard, right, Dratnos?
Yeah, so I think there's a combination of factors, right? Like part of it is the spot healing is weaker than like cooldowns and raid healing. I think another thing is personals are really strong, right? Like
a lot of classes have a lot of personals too.
Yeah, if you're gonna effectively, right, the buff to player health was effectively a nerf to how strong any heal button was, but a damage reduction stayed as powerful, right? So damage reduction cooldowns have gotten extremely powerful. Health pot, health stone especially because it's a percent health, but health pot also is just a huge flat amount of health that is still really substantial. So you get to this point where somebody living on Sentinel Telandros is kind of about, did they press a good defensive? Do you have bleed dispels? But even aside from bleed dispels, like did you press good defensives and health pots rather than did the healer target you and put 3 healing globals into you? Because 3 healing globals is going to be less valuable than a big cooldown or a health pot or something, which is weird and I think a relic of the way that they have nerfed healing. But I think they should be putting some power back into spot healing, especially because like I think that in the raid it's pretty healthy. Like I think in raid, when you look at fights like Rashok and stuff, the healing there is, it's good that they buffed they nerfed healing and they buffed health pools, right? But
exactly, yeah.
It's spot healing is I think a safe way to increase that and also return the identity of some healers. Right now, no healers are like doing spot healing in a raid setting, which is weird.
I don't think you had it pulled up, but Sups actually had like a funny tweet. He was doing Sarkareth Prog, and he's like, "Why is the Ret Paladin the best spot healer in my raid team right now?" Which, I mean, it's kind of true. Like no healers really have the identity anymore. It used to be like Holy Paladin, Shaman did like a little bit of it last expansion stuff. But yeah, like I think spot healing tools are like really weak right now. And then like Dratnos said, like Sentinel Telandros, and then also the boss in Neltharis, Forgemaster Gorek.
Oh yeah,
both of those I think are like, and I guess to a lesser extent, though I think this one's just like an unfair fight. as Neuraxis, but like all three of those fights are like personal usage is like prime on those 3 fights right now. So
I
if you can
would
press personals, it's really
say
good.
I would say that for Sentinel Telandris and Neuraxis, you can make a very strong case that both of those bosses are won at character select or composition select, where Sentinel Telandris, if you have a bunch of dwarves, a prop paladin, say we have 2 bleed dispels because we have 2 evokers in our group, that fight is very, very easy. And like Imberon, I think, is also a pretty good example of this. Like if you have a massive spell for that guy, and this is like the 3rd boss of or the 4th boss of Uldamon, if you have a massive spell for that guy, he's pretty trivial. If you don't have a massive spell, you're actually in a lot of trouble. And kind of something similar happens on Neuraxis, where it's like, if you have enough poison dispels, it's much easier than if you have none. Like you're going to be having a significantly different experience. And I think that is almost independent of what we were talking about today, right? Obviously, I think that those things are problematic in their own right. We haven't seen much Mythic Plus tuning. I think that this is actually the last round of Mythic Plus tuning that I have pulled up right here, which happened on May 16th. This is like so long ago at this point, relative
month and
to
a half. Wow.
Yeah, like
yeah, okay, that's a while.
I mean, there's a lot of bosses that we could just like list off that we think needs a varying amount of tuning, from a little bit to a lot of bit. And there's also trash mobs that need a little bit to a lot of bit of tuning. But then how does Elsmere's tweet really factor into this? If we remove the unfair bosses from the equation, being like, okay, these are clearly something that if Blizzard was actually nerfing bosses, this is something that would almost certainly get hit. Like, how is healer power relative to that? What does the healer role look like with that in mind as well?
So I will preface, I am definitely not doing as high keys as Elsmere is. So like I do ask him a lot of these things and stuff, and like Jack and a lot of the other healers that do like these 26s or whatever. But I do think healing checks it's much better to have a healing check in a key than it is like in Shadowlands, where you had like the reason you played Holy Paladin in season 1 is because they had Ashen Hollow, because they were beating your DPS and DPS on pulls, right? Like
I thought Holy Priest was the worst example of this too, because that season 3 of Shadowlands, Holy Priest healed maybe one boss a dungeon, and they were there literally to PI and Fey Guardians your DPS. They weren't there to heal. The tanks also didn't require healing that season. I mean, we're kind of in a similar spot where a lot of tanks don't require a lot of healing. I would say that it's a bit different than Blood DK last season Shadowlands, because the tanks require some healing. It's just not a lot right now.
It depends on the tank.
Yeah.
It's interesting though, because when we talk about healing being required, there's a couple different types of healing that different bosses require. And I think this season, when you compare it to last season, season 1 of Dragonflight had a bunch of bosses that would just nuke your whole group for lots of damage, right? Whereas this season, it seems like there's a lot of bosses that just like target and kill 1 or 2 people, right? Like even on a boss that does big overall damage like Neuraxis, it's somebody who's getting rocks thrown at them.
It is the rocks,
is the person perishing, right?
Yes.
Whereas when you look at like second boss and third boss of Quarterstars, bosses which took nerfs throughout season 1 of Dragonflight, those were bosses that just hit the whole group equally, right? Like they were just pulsing rot damage, which I think that means one thing they could do that would maybe solve some of what Elsmere is complaining about without making it go against what JB is advocating for.
Yes.
Is I think shifting some power into the spot healing kit of healers, because that would solve some of those without really making it like, oh, we're trivializing the overall HPS requirement here.
It's so interesting because rot heal fights are, in my experience, I actually think some of the more interesting encounters. If you think back about some of the most interesting encounters to have to survive on, Raging Tempest was one of them. That was heavy rot encounter. Like you said, second and third boss of Court of Stars, the first boss of Shadow Moon Burial Grounds. That dungeon didn't have a lot going on, but making sure that you lived the AoEs that were pulsing over and over again is actually super important. I think that like third boss of Halls of Infusion this season does actually a pretty good job at that too. It really tests your healer's ability. I do think that there's something wrong that it's only bosses though that's actually tested on. I think that maybe there's a problem with that.
I think it's really hard to make trash really test a healer, and I think I'm okay with that. If you're just getting slammed to the wall every single trash pack, it's probably not healthy.
That's not good, right?
Yeah, maybe like imagine if the dispel on the dragons of like Halls of Infusion, if it maybe it wasn't dispellable, but it did like quite a bit reduced damage, so you actually had to heal through it, like something like that, maybe. But I think I'm okay with trash not being, all that deadly.
How do you feel
Personally.
about the dragons in Vortex Pinnacle?
Those are cool. Like that's something that like
They're overpowered, but
yeah, they are.
Yeah,
But I
they're
think
fun in
that's
the
something
20s,
that
though,
you like plan for. Like, okay, I have a dragon coming up. I'm gonna save this cooldown,
Mhm.
and then we're gonna go into it. I'm gonna be a little bit nervous or whatever, but we're gonna make it. And like whenever you do heal it, it feels really good, especially on like a really high fortified key or something. So I think having some things like that is like nice for the healer to feel rewarding. But
I think that this tweet from Jack is also super true. It's like the perspective on if a tank or a DPS actually mess up a mechanic, and I feel like it is not fair at all. But I feel like if a tank or a DPS mess up a mechanic, everybody's like, all right, this is fine. But if a healer is unable to heal an encounter or heal a trash fight or something like that, people get irrationally upset. They're like, why did I die to healing? One heal, bro, you gotta heal more. It's like, it's not the same level of criticism I feel like is given to like a tank or a DPS if they make a mistake, or if you miss the like a DPS check, like a timer DPS check. It's completely different than if you aren't able to heal a boss.
See, that's another interesting thing is there's a lot of mechanics this season where there are damage or healing solutions to them, right? Like
Yes.
last boss Vortex Pinnacle, you can either kill the ad faster or heal more damage, right? There's a lot of cases like that where it's like you could either heal this or kill it with damage, right? Like or a massive spell or something like that, which obviously is the best solution whenever it's available to one of these mechanics. But yeah, I agree that like blame disproportionately lands on healers, and there's sort of this if something is like really hard to tank in a high key or something like that, I think that kind of gets accepted. But if something's really hard to heal in a high key, you see more calls for nerfing it, especially from not the healers, although from some healers.
I mean, sometimes it is the healers, right? Like, I mean,
yeah.
I don't want to say Elsmere is exactly calling for a nerf here, but he is saying that like
it depends. It's not uniform, right? Like some healers are like, no, keep it hard, right? Like JB, and then some healers are like, no, make this easier, right? Make
I mean,
this,
there is certainly a middle ground, right? Like there's very like we talked.
Yeah,
there's clearly some outlier
Nerf definitely
bosses.
just flamed Elsmere right before he tweeted that 100%.
Yeah,
so
100%.
Yeah,
That's
I think
a safe bet at any time.
I do think like part of the like healer blame is maybe brought over from previous seasons, especially throughout Shadowlands, where like because we didn't really have a lot of these healing checks, then like the healer was kind of just like the kind of like augmentation. I've seen this like take it thrown around, but augmentation is like the job doer.
Okay.
And healers kind of became that throughout Shadowlands, I think, is like if there's an affix or something, your healer was dealing with it. Last season it was like healer is doing explosive and stuff for obviously like more reasons than just like there's no healing to do, but like they had the most efficient globals and stuff, etc. But like it's been actually kind of nice. I've been doing like a ton of keys, gearing up my fresh alts and stuff, and like I got whispered from a enhanced shaman, and it's like, hey, I will always handle like one of the afflicted, and I was like, yo, that's really cool. And it's really nice when that happens, but when that doesn't happen, it's like the blame still gets passed to the healer, unfortunately. So
yeah,
and I think like the more people that are aware that like, hey, this is a really hard healing check, like I need to make sure to like try to help out the healer if I can, is something to be aware of as well.
What do you guys think about the identity of the role, where it's like it's kind of in a weird spot where it feels like it's in some it's not always true that it's like this, but it does definitely feel like this sometimes, where it's like a DPS that has worse DPS buttons and then heals sometimes, as opposed to like, I mean, it's just a situation where you don't have to heal every single trash pack, and you're not always like actively healing, and sometimes you get out healed by the hybrids, and it's like there's always a bunch of like weird stuff going on, and then there's always the discussion about are no heal keys acceptable, which I think we made a video on before, but like not super in the scope of that. Like, how are you feeling about the identity of the role, Theun, for Mythic Plus? Because it's fine in Raid, right?
I think it's largely okay in Raid. They've fixed like quite a few of the issues, I think. In Mythic Plus, it's always been kind of weird. Obviously, like you're usually just up against the timer,
yeah.
And so like the more damage you add in, the better it is for your group. It's always kind of been like an influx role. Like it kind of changes depending on the season. Like this season is like if you live the key, you probably are timing the key, and like I mean, I'm in the opinion that like healer DPS doesn't really matter this season much at all. If you're adding 30k DPS or 15k DPS as a healer, like that's not going to time your key. Just keep your friends alive. But in previous seasons,
definitely agree.
Like in previous seasons, like sometimes that's like incredibly valuable to add that extra damage. So I think you just have to be flexible.
I think that's an interesting thing to think about as well, is like, you know, every season the pressure lands on a different point of like, is it an overall damage check? Is the difficulty a certain really hard boss fight?
One shots.
Is it living the whole key? Is it one shots, right?
Yeah.
And this season it does feel like that difficulty kind of lands on stuff that is largely the responsibility of the healer role, right? Because like, if the key level went up by one more DPS checks worth, we'd still be able to do these keys, right? But like, we're hitting the point of failure based on like mostly damage, right? Mostly stuff that healers and defensives and stuff solves, which is, I'm not sure that's bad, but it is different than previous seasons have often been.
I do think it's actually really good though that healers have the ability to be able to impact a key on more of a level than they have in the past, because I felt like before it was just like so weird whenever it was like, oh yeah, your healer is just here to drop Ashen Hollow and do the most damage possible, and that's all you were looking at for the healer. Whereas now it's like, okay, we can actually wipe to this boss if our healer doesn't like set up their healer CDs perfectly and stuff like that. And that feels like, to me, as somebody who pushes a lot of keys, I don't mind that, right? Like I think that just, it's just a little bit different of agency. And at the same point too, like as a DPS player, you always sit there and you think, oh, I could have pressed my defensives a little bit differently to make it easier for the healer. And that actually, I think, creates good habits. And I think that is actually super important for all group members, not only just DPS players, but all group members to learn, is just like how to press your defensives correctly. And I think that is really,
I do
good.
think that maybe defensive pressing in general, and especially the difference between some specs defensives and others, is maybe something that maybe more of that should be shifted back over to the healer deciding whether the group lives and dies, rather than everybody pressing. Like it seems like there's some boss fights where it kind of doesn't matter if your healer is playing, it just matters if you're pressing your defensives properly.
I would agree.
Yeah.
I do think like that changed a lot with the class trees though, because they added a lot of defensive buttons to many classes. A bunch of classes have 3 to 4 defensive buttons.
Yeah, I do on the class, well, not so much the class tree, but the spec tree though. And I've noticed this kind of like a trend throughout all healers, but like especially so for, I mean, I main Resto Shaman, so I'm naturally going to use a lot of examples on Resto Shaman, but back to like the spot healing example, I can take like 8 different talents that buff chain heal, and I can take like 2 that buff my spot healing. So that's like, if they don't want to just like flat out buff every spot healing tool, I think it would be really cool to add in like maybe some more like talents that would enhance the gameplay of spot healing.
I will say
it's just another way to go about it.
Vigor and Earth Shield is so sick. Both of those buttons are very cool. Or both of those talents are very cool.
Yeah. I think one piece of tech that they could use more as well is this is 100% more powerful in a 5-player group tech.
Yes.
Okay.
That's something that they use a little bit of in a few spots, but I think that could be applied to more buttons.
Oh, absolutely.
Because there are a lot of buttons that are like kept at a pretty low tuning because of how they function in raid that would, I think, be fine to be more powerful and relevant in 5-player content. And they're doing this augmentation kind of out of the tin, is doing a bunch of stuff better in 5-player content. I think that would be a good going back through every ability and buffing a bunch of them in 5-player content. That like a bunch of non-damage abilities, right? Any healing or stuff like that.
Yeah, that would be like super sick. I know they did it for like Revival,
and,
Trank Totem, and both of those abilities actually feel impactful now, which is sweet. But I wish they would do that for even more. So
yeah, even buttons like, I guess Riptide doesn't make sense to have that kind of text for it, but you know, Healing Rain or Chain Heal even maybe. I'm not sure. I'm not a Resto Shaman scientist, but
just anything to like buff it in 5 mans without actually just like ruining the spec,
right?
For example, is
exactly
like good.
Any final thoughts?
Buff spot healing. I'm tired of watching my Ret Paladin just land hands people before I can actually heal them up. So that would be nice.
Okay. Any final thoughts, Dratnos?
Nope, no thoughts here. Head empty. Happy brain.
I think overall though it's good whenever the healer role is impactful, and I think that both JB and Elsmere have points where it's like you should be able to fail heal checks in Mythic Plus. I think that creates for a healthy game. I do also think that Elsmere has a pretty strong point about there are some bosses that feel absolutely miserable, and so hopefully there's some more tuning to dungeon bosses soon. That would be ideal.
We've been saying that for the past 5 of these videos.
Surely this is the video. That
This
gets
is the video. Yeah,
nerfed for
finally,
sure.
surely, cope. All right. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Theun, for joining us, and
Yep,
we will
no
see you guys
problem.
next video. Goodbye.